without any further talk, make sure to enter your questions into the chat, and I'm going to let you go. And John, if we get a question that's pertinent to what we're doing, we'll toss it right to you.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Scott. I really appreciate that introduction. It's certainly gracious. I have the tough act to follow. David Lamb remembers fireplace and chimney and historic masonry restoration, who is also, funny enough, one of my friends because of the Northern Kentucky Restoration Weekend. We met here. He's one of my close friends and actually one of the contractors that works for Habitat for Humanity for me on a regular basis. He mentioned that in our last presentation. I would be remiss if I did not mention my son, who is with us today, who has also been around for most of the time that the Restoration Weekend has been around. So he has been drinking deeply from all of these wonderful resources that are presented at the Restoration Weekend. He has gained a great love for preservation because we own a very old house and we work on very old houses. Between replacing box gutters and repairing plaster walls and redoing trim and hardwood floors, Israel, my son here, has gotten a great taste of what it means to really fall in love with these old buildings. So without further ado, I'm here to talk to you about plaster work. There are several, there's probably too great of a topic for just one small session. But I do want to hit on some of the main issues that I get on a regular basis when I do repair work for customers. Also, what I get in my work with Habitat for Humanity, where I see significantly damaged walls, old, broken apart wall situations, and also just questions that I get from friends regarding their old plaster walls. I am not a purist, but I am a believer that old plaster walls, such as the one that is behind me, and this is the Newport History Museum at the Southgate School, and I am currently at the beginning of one of my projects here to work for Scott. And one of the things that you'll see behind me is just a great sample of what an old dilapidated, broken apart plaster wall would look like. Now, I have already primed this with a product that I'll mention very quickly, this Master Protect P110. This is a product specifically designed to seal and to create a bonding primer for plaster on old masonry surfaces and new masonry surfaces for that fact. So you'll see behind me, this is not what the wall would actually look like. It has a primer on it. It's kind of gross looking. It has the consistency of Pepto-Bismol. So it's a little disgusting looking at the moment. It's streaked and running down. That's just because I took a pump sprayer here and spray the wall down. But maybe if you could pan just a little bit over here toward Israel, you could see this wall as well. I don't know whether you can see that or not. This is what the wall would look like once it was scraped down. All of the loose plaster that was here, you can see some of it has already come off. I've gone through and scraped. You know, Israel is a good resource to come by and chip off all the old stuff. He enjoys some of that. I have gone ahead and pulled everything that I could. And then the second phase on this particular job is to just prime it with it's like an acrylic bonding agent, really. And it would be okay to use like a concrete bonding agent, an acrylic bonding agent on something like this to seal this. Now, a little bit about what we're looking at behind me, just before we kind of get started about some of our potential problems on a plaster wall. This is, I like David's way of describing it. This is an old school wall. This is the old school, where you would have had a wood lath, and most of this is either fir or white oak that's been stripped down, and then it is nailed in with these tiny little lath nails, and then about a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch gap in between each one of these pieces of lath, or lathe, depending on what area of the country you're from. That is the substrate of what is known as a scratch coat. Okay, and so you have a a lathe backing or a lath backing with openings inside of it, and then you have a scratch coat of plaster. And so that's the first layer that you see behind me here on top of that. And see, after that, after there's a scratch coat, then on top of that is the finish coat. And typically there'd be one or two finish coats on top of that. And that would be the smooth coat. So you have a scratch rough coat, and then you have a smooth coat on top of that. And as you can see here, a lot of the finish coat or the smooth coat on top has come off. And then in places where there's damage, where there are pipes coming through at one point, where there have been various damage to the wall, you can see sometimes the strips of wood left have come off or broken off or been removed by various contractors. You can see here where you've got a piece of conduit above me that is actually protruding through the plaster. And for the sake of time, a lot of contractors just pound holes in these walls, and they don't realize that can create some pretty significant problems down the road. So what we're looking at is just an amazing example of wood lath, scratch coat, and then finish or smooth coat on the top of that. And those are the sort of different phases of the actual process of plastering that you're looking at right now. What I have done on this particular wall, we pan from over here to over here. You can see what it looks like without the acrylic bonding primer, and then you can see now what it looks like with the bonding primer. I put the bonding primer on because plaster is very porous, and it, especially the scratch coat and the lath, it will absorb water. And so when we're going about the process of redoing a wall that is in this kind of shape, it's necessary for you to prevent the water from the plaster itself when it's wet and the new product from absorbing into the wood and into the scratch coat, so that it doesn't dry too quickly. So that's what this bonding agent, this primer that I've put on here is all about. Now, as I'm looking at this, one of the things, because the bonding primer is sort of pungent, it has a nasty smell and it's really bad for you, that I need to make sure that I mention while we're talking about plaster work and what you're looking at here in this historic setting that we're in. One of the things that I need to mention is this gear here. Now, I need to make sure that you know that there are several things that you should wear when you're working on plaster work. Obviously, hearing protection. I play music and I really like to keep my ears and keep my hearing. And the other thing that I would really love to keep is the ability to breathe free and clear, which is why whenever you're working with plaster, whenever you're working with things like this, you need to make sure that you're wearing an appropriate respirator to do the work. There are my safety glasses, I believe, have actually fallen over there someplace, but you should also consider wearing safety glasses as well to protect your eyes, because plaster will sting, it will hurt, and it will cause an abrasion on your eyes that you should really try to avoid. So the appropriate things that you should wear hearing protection, you should wear a respirator, you should wear eye protection when you're doing this, and also consider wearing some gloves. Because I've been doing this so long, I don't really like how the gloves limit the way that I work, but they are rather important for you to prevent yourself from getting some kind of nasty chemical burns and getting some of the acrylic on your hands, which is bad for prolonged exposure. So you need to make sure you're taking the right precautions in terms of safety. That's very important to me, making sure that as a homeowner or whoever is watching this that wants to venture into the world of plaster repair, that they would take care of your body. It's very important so you can keep doing preservation work. Now, so the first thing that I'll mention is just that this is the old school, as David Lamb mentioned earlier. This is the old school. This is the old way, the earliest way of plaster work would have been with these wood strips called lath, then a scratch coat, and then a finish coat. There is something a bit further along than that I'll mention, and I have some of it here, and this is called extruded metal lath. Okay, and so this is the next phase, starting in probably the turn of the century, maybe a little bit later than that, when
2030s.
yeah, 20s, 30s would have been very heavily used. I love this product. And the reason that I want to mention the difference between several different types of plastering is that it really has a serious effect on how you do repair work on your own walls. The first thing that I mentioned is this wood lath, and that wood lath functions because, as you can see here, the plaster, when it is pushed into the wood lath, it protrudes into this opening and it creates what is known as a key in the back. And so you'll see in various places here where the scratch coat or the plaster, that initial coat goes in between the two strips of lath, it forms a head on the back of it that's almost like a fist that runs in between those to keep that plaster from coming out of the wall. In a situation which the newer format of plaster that was created, like Scott said, in about the 20s and was heavily used, and actually in this Southgate school when there was, I believe, a flood, right?
1937 flood.
The 1937 flood took out plaster from here down. And I don't know whether you can notice it, but the plaster above is in not good shape and the plaster below is still in very good shape. And it's because in a situation with the metal lath, all of these tiny holes function like these slits in the wood. And so you have much more gripping power on the plaster itself. So you have a situation here where this plaster is over 100 years old, or maybe a little under 100 years old, excuse me, and it's still intact, whereas the plaster above is falling off and in need of repair. So this is extruded metal lath, this is a wood lath, and there is something actually, because, and I mention this every time, in mid-century homes, beginning in the 40s and 50s, they started to use a product that is called rock lath. And it is an example of a product where the strips would have been about 18 inches to 2 feet wide, and they would have run horizontally across the studs, and they would have actually functioned like a solid scratch coat, and they look much more like drywall consistency. They're about a 1/2 inch thick strip that was manufactured so that then, instead of putting a scratch coat on, they would have just put on the finish coat on top of that, much more like drywall. And now in contemporary homes, we would have drywall frequently instead of rock lath, instead of extruded metal lath, and instead of this wood lath. So those are the three things that you'll see in a historic home in various eras. The earliest, obviously, is what you see behind me. The next, which is a very excellent product that I like a lot, and actually I go back with when I'm doing repair work. For instance, in this section here, I will repair this with extruded metal lath. And then the next phase of that is rock lath, which is, you can't really purchase actual rock lath anymore, and so many people use a gypsum board, which is, in my opinion, a radically inferior product because it absorbs water. So we don't want to do that. Now, without further ado, the first problem or situation that I see on a large number of the houses that we're in are cracks. And I get questions every year specifically devoted to cracks in historic plaster walls. How do I handle them? It might have been that somebody along the line had put up a picture, in this area here, there could have been a picture, and they drove a nail in between into these lath strips, and they drove that nail in order to hang a picture. It was fine until it wasn't. And that's because this piece of lath, this wood backing on the plaster itself, cracked when they were putting that nail in to begin with, and then it broke off the keys that are in between these two strips of lath. And because of that, this area of plaster comes off. It releases because there's no fist or there's no key behind those two strips of wood in order to hold that on. So in that situation, it's necessary to remove that area of the scratch coat, back down to the wood lath, and see exactly what the problem is. In this situation, the lath was broken. You can see this area here in this format is broken. And if I reach in, I can actually grab a piece of lath from the other side of the wall that has been broken as well. So typically I see cracks or broken out pieces like this because of damage that has been done to the scratch coat and to the substrate or the lath behind it. That happens very frequently along lines. So for instance, along a stud, if that wall has moved over time, yeah, this might be it. I don't know whether you can see any kind of a close up on this, but there is actually a crack in the scratch coat right along the edge of the stud. And that's caused because of shearing or because of movement forward and backward laterally. And when that happens, the scratch coat splits. The question is, what do I do if there's a split in the scratch coat or in my plaster? Should I just go to the Home Depot or to your favorite big box store? And should I just buy a 5-gallon bucket of green drywall mud and smear it on the top with some paper tape and call it good? Well, you can't do that. And here's why. Plaster resists water, and drywall or gypsum mud actually absorbs water. So they resist one another, and that creates a problem because over time that repair isn't going to hold. So there are several options in a situation like that. One of them is a system that I have kind of fallen in love with over time, which is the system that was started by some preservationists and made popular by a company called Big Wallies, which is a terrible name for a company, but the product is actually really good. And you can do an excellent repair by following their process. And one of the things that they do to repair a crack is this short introductory plaster repair that I'm going to show you right now. So the first thing that they do when there's a crack vertically or horizontally is that they would just drill on the plaster itself, standard drill bit, very, very tiny, into the stud, and then out. Now you'll see the good part about having this bonding agent on the top of this is that it didn't just throw dirt everywhere. It didn't throw dust. It just really limited what I did. So I drilled right next to the crack, about an inch away, and then I'm going to, if you would see if you can't switch that to a drill bit that's right with those filled set screws. I'm going to take this that basically I just make these up, and you can order what are known as plaster washers. But I see no reason to have a box of plaster washers when I can just make these up. This is just a rubber washer, rubber fender washer, and a stainless steel. It's very important that it be stainless steel screw. And then this is actually a seat from the plumbing aisle, where you can get some of these rubber seats, rubber washers and bushings. And so I just make these up. And when I do that, then I take into this hole, and then I put the screw in. But the first thing that you need to do is irrigate this hole before you put the screw in. And so the way that you do that is that you shop vac the hole out where there's no dust, and then you pump it full of this wonderful solution of bonding primer. You squirt that in the hole. I'm not going to do that because it's very messy. You wipe off the residual bonding primer from that. And then there's an interesting thing that you can do, which I did learn from their system, which is that, and I'm not going to show the actual product that I'm using. This is actually a power grab product, but you should use something with a high acrylic content or a high polyurethane content or a high epoxy content. And once you've drilled that, in order to repair this crack, you're trying to bond the old scratch coat and finish coat of plaster back to the lath and back to the stud. And so you pump that hole full of something with a high acrylic content or a high polyurethane content or a high epoxy content, so that the lath can bond again to the back side of the scratch coat and the finish coat and to the stud itself to actually recreate the bond that's been lost where these keys have broken off. And so because the keys are broken off, it splits, and you get this loose area of plaster. I have just now drilled this. I have vacuumed out all the dust. I have now put some acrylic bonding agent into the hole, and now I'm pumping it with a glue. And then that glue goes into the hole and fills up the void. You need to pump it completely full so that there's a ton of that glue back there to glue the piece together. Once that is done, and Izzy, if you can grab that, then, and can I have another one of those washers? Yeah, one of those. Excellent. You then go ahead and put this into the hole. I bounce the trigger of my drill to be as gentle on the plaster as possible. You don't want to create any more damage in the process of this. And so when you're doing this, I'm not going to go all the way here. What you're doing is you're essentially fixing this to the face of the plaster itself, and these rubber bushings should keep it from actually tightening so tight that it does more damage. You want a soft washer to prevent any more damage from that. After it has set for at least 24 hours, you want to then go back, and instead of leaving these, you want to remove them. Bounce the trigger, you want to be as gentle on the plaster as possible, and pull that screw out after it's in. And you want to use a long, again, stainless steel screw, because the stainless steel will not bond to that acrylic. It won't glue it to the face of this. You want to be able to remove it after you're done. And then you're ready for a top repair. That system is absolutely fantastic for handling a repair like this, because you can put those screws in all the way down the line, repairing both sides of something like this, staggered, so that you don't have any transition cracking horizontally on in a situation like this. And then once it's repaired, then the top coating can happen. Now, this is where I am not a purist, but I do believe that I am preserving the actual plaster itself. So what I would do in a situation where you are trying to repair old plaster and you're not replastering an entire wall like I am here, would be to then use a setting type compound. Now, there are several types of setting type joint compounds that you can use. The first is a USG product that I use frequently, which is Durabond 90, and it does have an acrylic content. It has a binding agent that makes it hard and bonds to plaster. And so it's important for the first initial coat to be made out of Durabond or a product like it. Once that Durabond layer has been done with a mesh tape or even a paper tape, Israel, if you'd hand me some paper tape. This is a standard drywall paper tape, perfectly reasonable to use in a situation like this over a crack. Using the Durabond, which has got, it actually has a chemical compound in the setting type joint compound. Once that's been done, then you can move to another setting type compound, which is Easy Sand. And this also will bond to plaster. It is not bucket drywall compound. Bucket drywall compound absorbs water and it will resist the plaster and it will delaminate. You do not want that. You need to make sure that you're using a product that is setting tight and hardens and can be sanded. And then in that situation, it will probably need 2 or 3 coats in an environment like this. It would need 2 or 3 coats to coat that crack, and then it would be sanded smooth to a finished edge on a crack. That's the first thing that I run into. The next situation that I run into that is brought to my attention a lot is this issue here. And yeah, Israel, if you'd step over here for me. This is an issue where the actual lath or the substrate behind the plaster has broken and needs to be repaired or replaced. Now, like I mentioned before, in this, I would replace that with a strip of extruded metal that would then go across this. Now, that would be if the wooden lath is broken and missing. Sometimes you can replace the wooden lath. Now, I would also make the recommendation that you use a like wood. So if it is split oak, that you would use split oak. If it is fir, that you would use fir. That you'd go back with something potentially even old if you can find it, and that it would be as close to what is there as possible. The other thing that you need to remember is that you should leave the gap for a key. Now, I did mix up some plaster to use today, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about how I would do that. It's a little bit dry because I mixed it up before my class, but we can make use here now. This is the first scratch coat that I'll be applying, and I use this product. This is a USG product called Structilite, and it is a scratch coat plaster. And one of the things that you might notice, and I don't know whether you can actually zoom in here, it is gritty. It has tooth to it like sand, okay? And that's just like this. It's rough. And the scratch coat needs to be rough so that the finish coat can bond to it. In a situation like this, a small repair, you would want to make sure, okay? And so I'm going to scoot this into the center of my hawk, okay? I'm just going to circle it up so it's kind of a nice little mound in the middle of my hawk, okay? Then I'm going to take a trowel. It is very important in this situation that you use a stainless steel trowel, and that you be able to use a trowel so that your arm can push the material into the lath itself. And the reason I say that is because if you don't, then it does not build the key that is behind the plaster, and it won't adhere to the wall. So what needs to happen, I'm going to step over here. I don't know whether you can see this, is that I need to grab the hawk, I need to lay it up against the wall, and then push. And so the idea is that I'm pushing as hard as I can so that it squeezes between these two layers and creates a keyway that the plaster can hold on to the wall. Here. All right. You can see that took a lot of plaster, just this little bit. And so the idea is that you're pushing it into these strips of lath, and then that material is creating a new tooth bed substrate so you've got something for the next finish coat to go onto. And obviously, and that is all. Trying to do this out of a bucket. Most of the time, a plaster, this is a bit dry. Yeah. It's been sitting there too. Most of the time, when you're doing plaster work, you would have a large steel pan laid out and all of your plaster mixed up at about 5 gallons at a time. And then you would work directly off of that. In this situation, you would want to make sure that all of these are broken out and chipped away so that you've got more tubes. And then you would hold your hawk up against the wall and push. And then all of it. And then it's a process of locking the plaster into the wall, and that pushing and floating pushes the plaster back into the actual keyways. Okay, and it is a messy procedure. So you need to make sure, and I don't know whether you can tell, but we did put drop cloths down across the entire floor. And so pull the residual plaster off of your hawk. And this now, because I also and most modern plasterers also do a considerable amount of drywall work. Because I do a lot of drywall repair, I'm still using a knife to pull that coat on places like this. So I'm filling in any of the gaps so that the scratch coat is consistent all the way down. And then you're pulling all of the scratch off of that finished layer so that it's at the same level for the finished layer to go on. And hopefully you can see how that goes into the keyway and it holds on. I'm also going to show with some of this extruded metal lath that I mentioned earlier, just how, and I don't know whether you can focus on this a little bit. I'm just going to put a dab right here, and I'm going to push it in. And you can see on that back side how it pushes through that keyway that is in the extruded metal lath, and it forms a grip that creates a almost concrete-like, mortar-like layer over the entire surface. So that's how you do the scratch coat first. And that's the base that all of this will go on with. Now, the next thing that I'm going to use is another USP product called Diamond. That is my finish. It's called veneer finish plaster. In an environment like this, where all of this has been delaminated and broken and the finish layer has come off, it's necessary to put a new finish layer over the entire surface. And that is done by floating on to the surface the finish layer of plaster. It is not gritty. Like I mentioned before, it's not gritty like this scratch coat. It doesn't have the same sand content or vermiculite content in it. And it has actual, it's a smooth, higher plaster content. And so it creates a hard finish layer that is floated on. And by that, I just mean that my trowel, when there is water, is what you do for a second. When there's water on a trowel like this, it builds this smooth layer of water with the material itself. It sits on the surface and it floats along the top of the stone-like material. And I can feel all of the imperfections in the wall this way. And that's how the plaster, you call it floating, because the trowel itself actually floats on the top of the wall, much like doing concrete work. So the first thing that we addressed was the crack situation. So if I've got a crack, and how I handle that with some of those fender washers and an acrylic bonding agent, as well as a glue, and sort of a modified finish setting type drywall compound option. The second thing that I mentioned was what happens when the lath is broken and the wall itself needs to be repaired with the scratch coat and finish coat of plaster on the top of that. The next thing that I'll mention is when you have to basically start over in a situation. And that would be where you are applying an extruded metal lath to a place like this, and then you are building up this same finish or this same scratch coat and then a finish coat on top of that. It is highly unlikely that most people who are novices are going to try to tackle a wall like this if they are trying to do plaster work. And so there is a middle ground that a lot of preservationists, a lot of plasterers like to use. Israel, will you set that down? Excellent. And the way that this is a product that I've been using for quite some time, and it is called Glid Wall. It is like a very large dryer sheet. And so many times what I see in a house is actually the plaster is not in bad shape, but it has split in places. It does have significant imperfections, and it needs a new layer on the outside of it in order to do a repair. This is a good middle ground so that someone who is not skilled with plaster but may be able to handle a little bit bigger of a repair can use. This product is just like a large dryer sheet, and it is porous. And so what we do with the Glid Wall, it cuts very easily. As you can see here, I'm trying not to cut toward myself here. It is a porous, very fiberglass mat-like material. And what we do with this is, say I only have one small area, which is a problem, and I need to do a repair to that area, I can coat that in a Durabond product, which is a setting type joint compound that has a chemical binding agent in it, like acrylic. And then I can put that on the wall and then initially thick, lay this over almost like wallpaper, and then I can pull off any excess so that it holds on. This creates a smooth layer, a new layer on the outside of the plaster that prevents it from cracking in situations. And then the compound itself comes through the face of the fiberglass and bonds it to the wall directly with a setting type material. That process will hold a wall together very well, and it is a good middle ground for people who are unfamiliar with plaster work. And also for people that are more familiar with drywall and gypsum products than they are plaster. What I would say is that it is an inferior product for this reason. You lose the heating and cooling potential and possibilities when you're using a drywall gypsum compound on the face of hard plaster, because it does not heat and cool and reflect the heating and cooling properties that a traditional true plaster would. So if my house is cool in the summertime, I want that to reflect back into the room. Whereas if I put a grid wall product across the entire wall or across section, it absorbs the cool air, it absorbs the heat, and then it prevents it from functioning the way that it traditionally was meant to function. So it is a good repair product. It's much more, it is far superior to a tape that you would use because it's much wider. It does bond entire sections to the surface of the material, and it actually it acts a lot like the old oil skin that people would have coated an entire wall with. So it isn't completely ahistorical, but it's not ideal. And
so you would say it's compatible with.
It's certainly compatible, but not
It'll give you the same effect.
Yes.
The same outcome.
Yeah.
Without using a historic technique. So
Correct.
The idea is using modern materials.
Yes.
To achieve a historic result.
Absolutely. And the goal is for the sake of keeping the building. So we had a crack that we addressed and talked about. We talked about missing lath from putting on a picture onto the wall. We also talked about larger repairs that would be done with extruded metal lath and plaster. We talked about doing some repair work specifically with grid wall, which is a coating, a fiberglass mesh coating on the outside. There is something else that I want to address that really just to draft off of David Lamb's masonry discussion. Most of the problems that I encounter in plaster work in historic homes are actually the result of poor masonry care. They are the result of years of neglect on the exterior pointing work or brick work on a building. And they then create issues where the water intrudes into the interior course of brick, and it is a problem because that then delaminates the plaster itself from the masonry wall, exterior masonry wall. So the best thing that you can do for your plaster is to take care of your brickwork and your pointing, and make sure that you are keeping the water from intruding into the house. Now, with that in mind, if the water does intrude, a very common problem is something called effervescing, where we have the calcium deposits and the mineral deposits within the brick masonry unit coming through the plaster itself. And it looks very much, and I don't have a good example here, but it looks like a chalking on the face. It's almost like little crystal fluff that develops on the outside of even paint. And the water pushes those minerals through the plaster work itself, and then it comes through, and you can see how those minerals then look almost like little fluffy fibers on the outside of the plaster itself. And then the plaster starts to die and it creates a hole. And you can rub it and it starts to come off, and then you can rub and rub until you get back to the scratch coat. And usually it's white and fluffy and gross. And it sometimes you'll see dust on the floor because of that scenario. In that environment, you need to cut that area. First of all, you need to address the moisture issue on the outside envelope of the house. That's number one. That is primary to keep that water from intruding. In fact, in that masonry wall or that area behind the plaster, frequently what I see is that people will just coat that plaster again and wonder why it comes back. Well, it comes back because there's still humidity within the wall. And so you need a good mason to come and repoint the wall to do some sealant on the outside, not a true water sealer, as David mentioned earlier, but just a repellent on the outside wall, so that then the water cannot intrude into the plaster. And then we need to put a dehumidifier in that area to suck out any of the water that is in the masonry wall. And I do that by tarping off an entire area with a visqueen or plastic, and then covering the area that is in question and putting the dehumidifier and letting it run for about a week. And I do that so that any residual moisture that is in that wall, once it's been sealed up, can come out, and any damage that's going to happen happens. Then after that, once it's been dried out completely, and I think it has to be down to like a 30% moisture content. Once that happens, then you can go back and cut out the bad sections. And I just use very crude tools, a box knife and a hammer and a chisel, to be as gentle. They're crude tools, but you need to be gentle on the plaster itself. And then you scrape out those areas, and they will look something like this, or they will look something like this. So you'll get down to the scratch. I don't know whether can you pan over here again, just a little bit. This is an area where you can kind of see that plaster is dead, and I can gently scrape away some of the old. That's what it ends up looking like. And it deteriorates very quickly into your hand. You can pull more off. That's what it looks like once the effervescing has happened and damaged the wall and then deteriorated. Once that's done and we can limit the moisture content in the wall, then we can go back with something to do a repair. Once again, I'm not a purist, and I think that the best situation there would be to use a Structilite product, which is this is a scratch coat, is what I used here on the wall. To initially go through and patch that hole. It has tooth to it, and that would be that beginning base coat that you would put on there. You would put an acrylic bonding primer, just like I did here. You put Structilite on top of that. The next coat that I use is a Durabond product, once again, which is a setting tight compound that has a chemical bonding agent in it to make it hard. And then after that, then you can apply a setting tight drywall compound, not a true bucket joint compound. You have to use something that is setting tight so that it bonds to the plaster, and feather all of that out. In an environment like that, if it's a small area, great opportunity to use some Glidwall, great opportunity to use this on a small repair. On a larger repair, you're probably going to want to do the entire wall, and you're going to want to coat that in something that is a setting tight gypsum, or actually a finished plaster. Couple products that I do have here. I don't know whether there have been any questions that I can field, but as we go, couple things that I want to address and mention. I realize that we're talking about plaster repair. There are some plaster components within our houses that are actually very important and worth saving, that I would be mistaken if I didn't go over and talk about a little bit. And one of those is that there are moldings in our houses that are plaster. There are crown moldings and head moldings that are actually built out of plaster. And in order to do those types of work, not only would you want to become expert in a scratch coat and a finish coat that I talked about earlier, but also there are products, and I'm going to just slide over here a little bit, that are gauging plasters that can be mixed in order to recreate some of those historic moldings. Those many of the time are mistaken for wood, and they are not. They're actually built out of plaster. Because plaster is such a wonderful product, and it's such a sort of time-honored, historic, very amazing, storied product, it has been used for centuries to do all sorts of amazing ornamental work. And so even on the exteriors of buildings, you'll see plaster cornices, you'll see plaster moldings, and that would actually prevent you from making them out of wood. You should not make them out of wood. You should recreate them out of plaster. And you do that with products like I have down here, this red top gauging plaster. You can build up this beautiful clay-like material, and that clay-like material can be then floated onto a wall with a silhouette cut into a piece of metal, and recreating some of those old, beautiful ornamental plaster works. And I think that we've actually had some classes in the past where people recreate and teach how to make those ornamental moldings, and it's just absolutely fantastic to watch. I like to try my hand at it, but I'm much better at making walls smooth than making walls bumpy. So I try to stick to what I'm good at, and hopefully we'll be able to get somebody in the future that can walk us through some of those things. Another thing that I have in the back is some lime. I want to make sure that you understand that the products that I've been using are modern products. They are the modern examples of what people use now to do true plaster work, but they are not consistent with what they would have used before. And much like David mentioned in his masonry talk, they would have used lime in their plaster, and that lime is a bonding agent, and it helps to make sure that the plaster has some not only hardness but also the appropriate amount of plasticity and flexibility, and that it can reconstitute itself over time to make it a much more dynamic product than something that just is hard, like David mentioned about cement mortar. Then it is flexible and pliable and able to repair itself over time. And so if we were to try to recreate that, we would be using some lime. We would also be mixing our plaster with plaster of Paris instead of using the Structolite that is a pre-mixed bag. I just wanted to make sure that I opened up for any questions that may have been presented.
So one of the questions actually has to do with the point that you just raised.
Okay.
Which is how the preservation community feels about using a modern product to achieve the same results, as long as it does not do any damage to the original historic work.
I've mentioned several times, Scott, that I am not a true purist. By that, what I mean is I believe in using modern products that achieve the same end, but that comes at a limit. I would not believe in ripping the wood leg out and the scratch coat out and the finish coat out and then replacing it with drywall and gypsum mud. That to me is not achieving the same goal. Because it functions differently in a house. And I mentioned this earlier as well, which is that the hard surface of plaster reflects the heating and cooling properties of a house. And it actually makes the house function in the way that it was meant to, and the way that it was designed for hundreds of years to function. If I replace this with a soft paper material over gypsum, it absorbs heat and it absorbs cooling, and it does not do what the house was originally meant to do. And so I am in favor of repair, which is actually more cost effective as well. That's the other thing, is that it is more cost effective to do repairs, and it is meant to be repaired, which drywall and gypsum are not. And so I strongly favor doing a repair or doing a true plaster replacement with modern plaster, as opposed to jettisoning on something historic simply because you can't get the materials.
And do those modern materials handle better more the way we moderns live? You know, we now heat our houses with central heating, whereas they used to be spot heated by room. So do those modern materials handle the modern world better for the long-term life of the plaster?
And certainly the modern plaster's not a problem. I am very biased about not using drywall on a historic home because of the way that it's supposed to function. I much more value the plaster because of the issue with heating and cooling, and I do believe that it functions actually far superior to drywall, even with a modern heating and cooling situation, than you know, a modern product that is made of gypsum, because it's soft.
The goal is still to keep the heat inside the house.
The goal is still to keep the heat inside the house, and you may not need as much heat and as much cooling if you are using the house as it was intended.
So that leads us to one other question, and then I think we're going to wrap up, is that you've identified a lot of products.
Yes.
And some of the things, such as the attachment method, you talked about how you could get it at just regular hardware items.
Yes.
Some of these other things that you identified,
Yes.
are those readily available within our market?
Yes.
For individuals to buy?
Everything that I have purchased here has been purchased within a 20-mile radius of Newport, Kentucky. It is easily purchased from the more difficult things, for instance, like the autoclave finish line, which you know, very few people would be using the gauging plaster. Those things were purchased at United Building Materials, which is just downtown, very easily accessible to here, 5-10 minutes from this place. Everything else can be purchased at a big box store. USG is a very common name brand for those types of materials, and can be purchased in the drywall aisle of any of your big box stores, including the extruded metal lath. So repair materials, I try to keep to what is available to a homeowner to teach, so that they can have access to any of the products that I've shown you today.
Great. Yeah. Well, John, thank you for sharing your expertise with our wider audience. Stay tuned. The next on this channel, I keep calling it a channel, I don't know whether that's right or not, but we will be discussing box gutter repair. And so there will also be sessions running throughout the day and again tomorrow. I'm pretty sure that we're planning to rerun your plaster session tomorrow, so that so people that didn't get a chance to tune in today. But all of the videos, every session that's been here, so if you've missed a session because you were watching another one or something you wanted to see, or you want to go back and check something, we will have them available on our website in the near future. So keep a lookout for. We're also will be offering some hands-on workshops to give people an opportunity to try as the world is opening back up again. So thank you very much, John. Always a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your craftsmanship with us. And thank you all for tuning in.